Libertarianism is all about individual liberty, and it should never be defined by the terms liberal or conservative.
And communism is no good.
That's right. Big swing and a miss.
Yeah. And what's the word for when a few clerics are in charge? Religious oligarchy.
Holy
I can remember things.
I know the sun gon' shine, the sun gon' shine.
Right now, I got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the walls. The chair is against the wall.
Boys and girls, prepare to be astounded, bedazzled, and otherwise stupefied.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
You are now listening to Peace Propaganda.
And we're here for you.
Peace Propaganda. This is episode 33, December 7th, 2014, and I am your host, Adam Elpo. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Peace Propaganda. It's been over a month since my last episode, so etc., apologies. I'll try to do at least 2 this month, but, you know, the holiday season and all that. I hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving. I sure did. Got to see the family. And if you were one of the unlucky few working on Thanksgiving, thank you. I got a nice TV. So, for this episode, I'm going to do something a little bit different. Well, different and the same, sort of. When the show started, the show, I think, was a bit more focused on anarchism and libertarianism and things like that. And while I'm going to try to keep it lighthearted, I'm going to make this show sort of an intro to anarchism. And before everybody turns off, I'm going to keep it lighthearted. It's not going to be, I'm not trying to convince anyone. In fact, I think trying to convince someone of a political point is the surest way to make sure that they just dig their heels in even deeper on their existing political mindset. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm not, if you listen to this whole show and you're like, you know what, that guy was fucking crazy. That's fine. That's fine. I don't care. I'm in for the long haul. Doesn't matter. But I want this show to be something that my listeners can share with friends of theirs, with people that they know, or I want the show to be something that my listeners who may not be necessarily anarchists to get a fuller understanding of where I'm coming from, because sometimes I feel like I'm jumping to the end of the discussion. I'll bring in a story, or I'll start talking about something, and then I'll jump to the end of sort of an anarchist critique. And I realize that I can be losing some people along the way of why I'm getting there, and that can be very disjointing. And I imagine that some of my listeners who are anarchists have been in that situation in a conversation where any random topic will come up, it's just something on the news will come up. And the anarchist in the room will say something that to the other people in the room is sort of a non sequitur or seems almost naive or simplistic. And that's very common, at least for me, which is why I tend to just not say anything. And that doesn't help anyone. So I'm hoping that this can serve as a useful primer into the world and to the mindset of an anarchist. So, with that said, I think the most valuable thing in this type of conversation is defining your terms, okay? And also one of the hardest things is defining your terms. So you kind of gotta, if you're not an anarchist, I'm speaking to you now, you kind of just gotta go with the terms that we're using, and try not to fight it too much, because the unfortunate reality is that a lot of these terms have multiple meanings and long histories, and they justifiably mean different things to different people. But rather than basically literally invent our own language, anarchists have been forced to use terms which already exist, which admittedly may be imprecise in common usage, but it's just sort of the state of things, okay? So you got to take us, look at the argument, not the terms that we're using. Okay. So the first thing, anarchism. This is a perfect example. Long history, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Left anarchists get apoplectic when they hear, anarcho-libertarian or anarcho-capitalists, describe themselves as anarchists, and not unjustifiably. It means very different things to them. I understand. So an anarchist in my tradition is what might be called a propertarian anarchist. This is somebody who believes in property, as opposed to a left anarchist. Okay. And so, a propertarian anarchist, an anarcho-libertarian, believes that the people have the moral justification, one might say the right to themselves, their body, and their property. And within there are varying degrees. Some people describe the body as property. That's not terribly important for our discussion. Okay, so an anarchist, the way I use it, the way that people of my tradition use it, they're saying without rulers. It comes from the Greek, an, meaning without, and archos, meaning ruler. Not without rules, not without law, without rulers. And so this almost harkens back to a Marxist analysis, more specifically a Max Weber analysis. The sociologist Max Weber, who described society as class-based. Now, many propertarian anarchists have since shed that, just because the Marxist analysis is so obviously intertwined with communism, which is sort of the opposite of what I'm talking about here. But it's hard to argue that, at least in this point, Marx was right. There are classes in society. Generally speaking, the haves and the have-nots. Okay. Now, how an anarchist of my tradition would describe this is there are people who can exert their will upon others, and people who have will exerted upon them. Okay, and even this still sort of jives with what Marx is saying, right? Now, where we diverge, Marx talks about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and he talks about sort of business interests as being the haves, and the proletariat, of course, sort of the peasant class being the have-nots. And there's not a lot of criticism, at least in popular Marxism, of the people who are able to exert physical coercion. And so this is where we get into Max Weber. Max Weber was a contemporary of Marx, was a contemporary of the political economist Ludwig von Mises, who's very important to propertarian anarchism. Max Weber was a sociologist, and he gives us our definition of the state. So we just defined anarchism, which is without rulers. Now we come to a definition of the state. And the state, as Max Weber put it, Max Weber was not an anarchist. I just want to be clear. I'm not cherry picking some obscure anarchist from history. Max Weber was a famous sociologist who uses the term government the way that I will use it. And he wrote, its administrative staff successfully upholds a claim on the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. Okay, so that's a mouthful. Let me repeat it. Its administrative staff successfully upholds a claim on the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. So that's the important part, the monopoly of physical force. And how does this, and this is what we have today in most societies in the world. Zomia might be an exception. If you're not familiar with Zomia, Z-O-M-I-A, that is basically an anarchist area in northwestern China. Anyways, the monopoly use of physical force, this is where we get the courts and the police. This is also the minarchist conception of political philosophy, that basically the only legitimate use of government is the use of physical force to maintain order. Okay, so this is pretty much the rub. This is where anarchists break from other political philosophy conclusions. Anarchists believe that it is not necessary or legitimate for a government to have a monopoly use on physical force. Okay, so this perhaps already is very different than the popular conception of what libertarian anarchism is. I think a lot of people, and not unjustly so, given the popular portrayal of libertarian anarchism, but a lot of people associate it with big business interests. A lot of people associate it with Rand Paul, or even Ayn Rand, which is just flat out wrong. Ayn Rand actually described anarchism as naive and dangerous. So we do not even break bread with Ayn Rand for the most part, okay? Not interested in that. And the idea that anarchism is beholden to big interest or is furthering the agenda of big money interests is short-sighted, I think. Or at least it doesn't fully encapsulate what anarchism is really about. And honestly, what anarchism is really about is what this show is about. It's about peace. It's about, we believe that when the state has a monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order, that tends over time to lead to corruption. It leads to escalating violence over time. And I don't just mean in one instance. I mean the use of violence by a state escalates, year by year, decade by decade, because of basically power creep. This idea that, well, once the state does something, now it has a precedent for it. Lawyers would call this stare decisis. And in the courts, the idea that once there's a precedent for it, then they can do it, and then they keep pushing the boundaries. Then they keep digging into their bag of tricks deeper and deeper and deeper. And every time somebody cries foul, the state and its defenders, its apologists, will say, hold on, you can't say that they're not allowed to do this because they already did that. And look, the world didn't fall off its hinges. No, it's not, society's not going to crumble. They already did that. Oh, yeah, maybe they're doing 5% more than they did last time, but what are you going to do? You're going to stop all of society over that 5%? Just shut up, you crazy anarchists. Shut up, you crazy small government types. Just get with the program. And so this illustrates the wider view that anarchists are taking of government. We're not looking at the individual 5% power creep on each individual state action. What we're looking at is the underlying philosophical justification of government and its monopoly use on force. And we're trying to point out this trend of escalating violence, of escalating corruption, and of diminishing returns, quite frankly. Okay? So we got the music coming up. I'm going to go to break, and I'm going to come back with a little bit more of a deep analysis. Stay tuned. Have you heard of the Electronic Frontier Foundation? The EFF is a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting your rights online. They fight illegal surveillance, advocate for users and innovators, and support freedom-enhancing technology. The state wants to limit what you can do online, including attacking whistleblowers, bloggers, and podcasters because it considers them to be non-journalists. Support the Electronic Frontier Foundation today with dollars or bitcoins by visiting EFF.org. That's EFF.org. And I am back, Adam Elpo with Peace Propaganda. And I want to remind you, or inform you for the first time, if this is your first time listening, that if you like to contact the show, please do. You could email me at host.peacepropaganda@gmail.com, or you could find me at Twitter at Peace Podcast. I'm also on Facebook if you look for Peace Propaganda. I'm not super active on Facebook, but I do get notifications, so, if that's your preferred method of communication, please feel free to contact me there. So, before the break, I had just defined anarchism and government. And there are more things that certainly, if you get deeper into the literature, that require definition. But I think for this purpose, for the purpose of this show, that'll do. That'll do. So now I want to get into a couple of the more in-depth criticisms that anarchism offers, and I say criticisms. I think a lot of people, how do I say this? It is often leveled against anarchism that anarchism is not a positive prescription for society. It is nothing but negatives. It's the government's fault. Oh, it's the fault of the Federal Reserve, or it's blah blah blah's fault, or it's blah blah blah's fault. And I'll be honest, that's not entirely unfounded. That is, in fact, that's pretty much the gist of it. Anarchism, generally speaking, is a form of criticism. It's not a prescription for how things ought to work. It is a analysis of how not to do things fundamentally, and that may seem unhelpful. And so I'd like to just talk about that for a minute and why I think that's not really the point. And I think to look to anarchism for a roadmap of how to build a society is to misunderstand what anarchism offers, and which would be unfortunate, because I obviously think that anarchism does have a lot to offer. So when you look at, I think a historical analysis would be the most beneficial point of view here. Let's say we were all listening to this podcast in 15th century France. Yeah, I know. But for real though, let's say we're all sitting around in 15th century France, and we're very tightly under the thumb of a religious oligarchy and the crown. And somebody is saying, I don't think this is just. I think maybe it doesn't make sense that people get to tell us what to do based on religious texts or based on a divine right of kings. And other people, I'm trying not to characterize the people in 15th century France, because I'm sure they were very bright. But many of them, I suspect, probably would have the response of, well, maybe that's true, but, so what's your point? This is what we got. We got to work within the system, and I think that that's comparable to how a lot of people respond to anarchism today, and I think that response to anarchism lacks that historical perspective, because in fact that is what a lot of the writings from previous forms of government, that's what you see in a lot of it. It's people being apologists for the existing order, based on the fact that the critics of the existing order, the old monarchy, the old religious oligarchies, the critics of those didn't necessarily have a bulletproof plan for the way to move forward in society. That said, I think most people would agree that democracy, imperfect as it is, even an anarchist such as myself would generally agree that democracy rolled the ball forward for individual liberty. It rolled the ball forward for people's ability to be self-determined, pursue their happiness, et cetera, all the squishy, good feeling stuff that you hear in civics class. I think that's generally true. It's better to live in 21st century Europe or America than it was to live in 15th century France, politically speaking. So, someone criticizing the old system would not have been out of line to say, this isn't how we should live. There's something better. And it would miss the point of what they were saying to level at them. Okay, well, what do you got? Because imagine if they gave their answer. Imagine if they were just tilling their field and they were like, what we should do? We should divide the country into all these districts, and then we should elect representatives, send them to a central location, and they will debate them and, basically describe a modern democratic process. That person would be laughed at as a wild, naive lunatic, and there would be about 1,000 ways to criticize their proposals, and justly so. just as you could criticize what we currently have, right? I mean, even the most lucid thinkers, even the most lucid defenders of a democratic process are riddled with logical fallacies and holes. I'm talking about John Rawls. I'm talking about Locke. I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson, Robespierre. Go through the list. And the fact is, they were defending a system which, at its core, has some very fundamental flaws. I'm speaking here of political democracy, the idea that the majority has the right to inflict its will on the minority. Okay, and this comes to what anarchism is. It is a criticism of as we were saying before, the monopoly use on force, and by extension, the way that is currently wielded in a modern democratic process, which is the majority's use of force on the minority. This is where a lot of people back up. This is where a lot of people get, they raise their hairs and they say, hold on, why are you anarchists always exaggerating ad infinitum? It's not like every time a law gets passed, a gun gets stuck in somebody's ribs saying you got to do this. And while that is literally the case, yes, of course, they don't literally send out stormtroopers to everybody's house saying, hey, this is the new law, get with the program. Got it? That's what a more traditional mafia might do, as opposed to a government mafia. But it is backed by that threat of force. I mean, it's pretty much right there in the three branches of government. You have the judiciary, which interprets the law. You have the legislative, which makes the law. And you have the executive, which enforces the law. And it's no coincidence that the executive is in charge of the military and the police. What's the common denominator there? The military and the police use physical coercion to, what was it that Max Weber said? In the enforcement of its order. So get with the program. And if you don't get with the program, that's what the executive is there for. Right? So I don't think it's a particularly contentious thing to say that every law, every regulation that a democratic government passes is, in fact, backed by the use or the threat of use of violence. And this goes right back to Max Weber's definition. Its administrative staff successfully upholds a claim on the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. Okay? And so that's a long discussion to get into over cocktails. And that's why I tend to stay away from immediately jumping to, well, I just think it's wrong to use violence to enforce laws, because a lot of people, that's not how they imagine the state. They imagine the state as in much more, in my opinion, idealized terms. And you can ask somebody to describe government to them. If you ask somebody, what is government, or do we need government, they will generally go into a description of, I just think it's a good idea that we all get together and agree on rules that we can all, make each other better by, that we can all agree on rules that keep people safe, et cetera, et cetera. And, I think most anarchists would agree with that. You may be surprised to hear. It's not about making rules. It's not about all having a common understanding, generally speaking, of what the rules are. It's about how do we get to those rules? How do we enforce those rules? Okay? So I'd just like to stop right there, because it's worth pointing out that idea of government, the idea of government that's in the popular mindset, that we should all sort of get together and agree on a common baseline understanding of what's okay and what is not, most anarchists would agree with. Like most proprietarian anarchists, especially. The proprietarian anarchists are generally seen as kind of like law and order type. Many of them come from a minarchist background where the last vestige of what they thought government should do is police and courts. So that's worth pointing out. There actually is a lot of common ground, at least at the fundamental understanding of the underpinnings of society, that obviously it shouldn't be a war of all against all. There should be a common understanding of what's good for society. So I'm going to get into the third and final part of this program with where anarchists really diverge, and probably the part that most people will disagree with most vehemently, but that's the fun part, right? I'll be right back.
'Cause baby, I'm an anarchist, you're a spineless liberal, we march together.
I want to take this opportunity to tell you about Sean's Outpost, a homeless outreach program which has provided over 20,000 meals to the homeless in Northwest Florida. They're also funded entirely through Bitcoin donations. They are proving that we can address the problems in our community without the state, without its predatory welfare programs, and without its Ponzi money. Recently, Sean's Outpost launched its newest, boldest initiative, Satoshi Forest, a 9-acre homeless sanctuary where they are teaching permaculture, aquaponics, and self-sufficiency to the homeless residents. No one sticks a gun in anyone's face and makes them donate to Sean's Outpost, and yet, every day, people do. Please consider donating to this inspiring cause. Visit seansoutpost.com. That's SEANS outpost.com.
I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart. In my heart.
All right, we're back for part 3 of episode 33, a friendly introduction to anarchism. Hope you're enjoying it so far. I hope it hasn't been too contentious, and I hope you'll agree with what I said at the beginning, which is that I'm not here to try to convince you of anything, okay? Not about that. Not interested in that. I don't do this show. I don't even ask for donations to the show anymore. I just do this because I enjoy doing it, okay? So, I urge you in this part of the show to obviously always think critically of what I'm saying. You don't need me to tell you that. And I just say that as a predecessor to what I'm about to say. Rather than, in these next 2 points I'm about to make, rather than come at it as, here's why he's wrong. Still think critically, but try to think about it as, what if he's right? What implications might that have? Okay? That's all I ask. Just give it a fair hearing. Try not to shut it out before you even hear it. So here we go. I'm gonna list 2 non-essential conclusions of anarchism, and what I mean by that are that what I'm about to say, contrary to what I said in the last part, which is that anarchism does not offer a prescription for society, these are 2 non-essential prescriptions. These are ways that you might go with anarchism. Just as a critic of royal France is on very firm standing, saying, you know what, I think royalty is wrong. Where they go from there could go, you could go a million different directions from there, from that stable conclusion. So here's where I'm going a couple of different directions from what I consider to be a very stable criticism of what government is, that monopoly use on violence. So you may disagree with what I'm about to say, but you may agree in parts, and you might be able to expound on parts of it, and I'd be very interested in hearing that. So remember to contact me at host.peacepropaganda@gmail.com if you get inspired by anything that I'm about to say. And there's nothing wrong with that, and I have no problem saying that because what I'm about to say is not original at all. In fact, some of it dates back hundreds of years. Okay? So, I'm going to try to list resources where I can. If I forget, please email me. I'd be happy to point you to where I got these ideas from. Okay, so the first non-essential conclusion of anarchism is Austrian economics. Austrian economics is not the economics of a country in Europe. It is named that because the progenitors of this branch of economics came from Austria, basically. And it was actually used as a derisive term by the more popular schools of economics, which were coming out of Germany. But the name stuck, c'est la vie. Austrian economics is most commonly associated with Murray Rothbard, Henry Hazlitt, Dr. Bob Murphy, and it's one of its most famous, earliest progenitors, Ludwig von Mises. He wrote Human Action, and in Human Action, he argues that the free market economy not only outdistances any government plan system, but ultimately serves as the foundation of civilization itself. That description is from Wikipedia. I highly recommend you at least check out the Wikipedia page for Ludwig von Mises. Very interesting story. He escaped from the Nazis, and he served as like a high government official, actually, in the chair of economics in Austria at sort of the height of the Austrian Empire. Very interesting stuff. Or not the Austrian Empire. It was shortly after the Austrian Empire. Read the Wikipedia page. It's fascinating. Anyways, so he argued, as I said, that the free market economy serves as the foundation of civilization itself. And so there you have to sort of parcel out what free market economy is. What he's talking about there is not necessarily ideas of like deregulation, although it does involve that. It's like radical deregulation. It's the idea of the only way to make sure that both parties in an exchange are doing so to their mutual benefit is to make sure that there is no intervening third party. And so the idea there is, if I come to you to sell you something and you come to me to buy something from me, we can be pretty sure that we both are doing that willingly and that we both consider ourselves better off after the exchange. I am radically simplifying the argument here for the purposes of time. As I said, this is a non-essential conclusion, but I do tend to agree with it. So I recommend looking up some of those names. Ludwig von Mises. Henry Hazlitt is very good. He used to write for the New York Times, as a matter of fact, during World War II. He wrote a very influential book called Economics in One Lesson. It's only about 90 pages long. It's really worth reading, and it's bullet points. It's not dense at all. It's basically addresses, well, what about this about free market economy, or what about this? And he just lays it out in just a few paragraphs. And if you are curious but you have your criticisms, that's a great book to pick up. So they also argue in Austrian economics, and I think this may be the more prescient point, that economics is not a hard science like physics or mathematics. This, I think most people would actually agree with. Interestingly, the common perception of economics, often called Keynesian economics, treats economics as a hard science. And so this is when you start to see supply and demand curves over time, and you start to look at the M1 versus the M2, and you get to all this economics jargon and statistics, yada yada yada, planning the GDP, the Federal Reserve note, the inflation of the money. All the stuff that most people generally associate with economics is all wrapped up in Keynesian economics, and this idea that economics is something where a few very informed people at the top of society can pull the strings and sort of fine tune the machine is a metaphor that they like to use, or prime the engine of the economy. This most anarchists of my tradition consider Philistine nonsense. It is an attempt to hogwash people through the use of scientism and jargon. It's a way to confuse people, to make them think that they are not qualified to think about the issues that affect them most directly. And Austrian economics is a way to unpack that and say, no. It's really not that complicated. You don't need people at the top to tell people who are trading at a person-to-person level, how they should be trading. Because the reality is, people know what they want. People generally speaking can figure it out, and not necessarily individually, but collectively. People can form companies, for mutual self-interest. People can form cooperatives. Cooperatives and Austrian economics really go hand in hand. As a matter of fact, a lot of sort of new agey type, what was generally considered new agey type economic relationships really date back to the fundamentals of Austrian economics. This idea of collective action in the economic sphere, because that is an example of voluntary association as opposed to top-down, hard science Keynesian economics. Okay. So that's the description of Austrian economics, a non-essential conclusion of anarchism. The second non-essential conclusion of anarchism is the provision of private law and defense. Okay, so the idea here is this is tackling sort of the minarchist idea of government. The idea that maybe if you throw out everything else that the government does, maybe they don't belong in X, Y, or Z sphere of society. But surely you agree that the government is necessary to keep property safe, to repel invaders. Police, courts, military. Anarchists disagree with this wholeheartedly. And in fact, in my opinion, that is the most dangerous aspect of government. The combined, it's not important. It's the most dangerous aspect of government, in my opinion. This view of anarchism is strongly associated with the term anarcho-capitalism, a deeply problematic term, in my opinion, because it evokes just a whirlwind of misunderstanding. It might be more aptly described as the contractual society or the voluntarist society. This is the idea that everything in society ought to be voluntary. And not a terribly helpful term, I must admit. But the idea here is that most conflicts would be resolved through a series of pre-existing contracts, and it is typically associated with the idea of what you might consider to be insurance companies. So, for example, you try to head off eventualities through the provision of insurance. So, if you're going to get a car, you might get into a car accident. You should probably get car insurance. Similarly. You want to get renter's insurance in case your stuff gets stolen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is to expand what these insurance companies are responsible for. Okay. And so if, for example, your TV gets stolen and you have insurance against theft, as many people today do, typically today the insurance company is responsible for, basically a payout. If you can prove that you had insurance, that it was covered, yada, yada, yada. The idea here is the insurance company would be responsible to make you whole. Okay? So it might just be a payout. If the trail is cold, they might just pay you out, especially for something small like a TV. But what if your car gets stolen? What if your whole house gets robbed? Well, then the insurance company has a real interest in figuring out what happened. And so there are a wide array of implications there. If the insurance company has the responsibility and the ability to figure out what happened. So they might, for example, you might get a lower rate on your insurance if the insurance company can put a camera outside your house to see, who might have left with stuff, or, et cetera, et cetera. You could think of how this might work, that the insurance company might want to lower its liability. And in turn, you would lower your payments, and then the insurance company would go to the private defense companies. This is the second part, the private law and defense. So the defense part, the idea here is that you would have competing defense agencies. It's a very long conversation, but the gist of it is those defense companies which do the best job for the lowest costs will generally win in a competitive market. A lot of people think that if you have competing private defense companies, that whichever one happens to be biggest will just take over the rest by violence. And this is a social argument. It's not a hard science. I'm not here to prove anything, but I do think that there are a lot of compelling arguments to say that is probably not the case. That it would actually be much more economically feasible to just compete in the market, to just get customers. Rather than try to, basically pay soldiers of fortune to go kick down everybody's door, if you could even get your investors on board for such an insane enterprise, or if you could even get, the members of that community to strap on body armor and go kick in the doors of their neighbors to take over their company. I personally think that is an unlikely situation, especially in, if you were to transition from a modern first world democracy into a modern first world anarchist society. I think most people's sensibilities would preclude such a thing, even if there were a few sociopaths in charge of these companies. I strongly recommend looking up, just Google private defense companies. There actually are a few examples in history of such a thing. For example, the Secret Service used to be known as the Pinkertons. And this was a private eye / private defense company that operated all throughout the American Southwest to such great effect. They were so widely popular and respected and successful that they were eventually nationalized into this Secret Service. Interesting story, because they actually didn't really want to be. They were sort of cajoled into it, as government is wont to do. And also the Boston Police Department used to be private. The San Francisco Police Department used to be private. There is now, since the collapse of Detroit, a really successful, it's called Detroit Threat Management Center. I did an episode about it before. You can look in the archives or just Google Detroit Threat Management Center. And it is a private defense company. And they provide free defense to residents of Detroit. And it's funded by the companies in those areas, mostly like the tobacco companies and et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty interesting stuff. I think a lot of people, even people who are hostile to the idea of anarchism, might find some things in there that they find interesting. So that's the anarcho-capitalist contractual society view of private law and defense. There's also the agorist view. Also, this is also known as counter-economics. This is popularized by an individual known as Samuel Edward Konkin III, or Sec 3. He considered libertarianism to be radically leftist, if you can believe it, which actually is a viewpoint that I generally agree with. He rejected voting. To be inconsistent with libertarian ethics, which obviously, once you've gone from libertarianism to anarchist, this is, pretty much a conclusion that you have to accept, that voting is inconsistent with anarchist ethics, to be sure. If you're interested in the idea of why it would be considered radically leftist, you might want to look at the movement of the libertarian left. There's also a website called Bleeding Heart Libertarian. They're not strictly anarchist, but they're very sympathetic to the ideas of Konkin. And he popularized the idea of agorism, or counter-economics. This is the idea of you withdraw your consent of the existing system by engaging in action in the black or gray market. So that means try to avoid paying your taxes, which, most people do anyways, but, really as much as you can, try to structure your life such that you are not paying taxes, so that you're not paying into their system. It's also the idea of try to do things that fall out of the scope of regulation. Basically try to provide examples of how things can be done without the state. A beautiful example of this is actually Bitcoin. If you're not familiar with Bitcoin, it's private money, which is not issued by any government. It exists on the internet, and by many experts' opinions, is the finest form of money which has ever been created, because it is basically impossible to create fraudulent notes. It is frictionless. In other words, you can send money across the globe in an instant for a fraction of value, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a big fan of Bitcoin, as frequent listeners will know, and that is a perfect example of counter-economics, the idea of we disagree with public money, with the idea of the dollar, so we're going to make our own, and it's going to be better than the government one because of all of the ways that government fails. All right, so that's a philosophical, political philosophical economic argument that dates back to Mises. Remember, he said that the free market economy outdistances government planned systems. And so the idea of agorism is, well, if that's true, then there should be examples of that. We should be able to not necessarily convince people that government is bad. We should just be able to outcompete them. And I am very sympathetic to this argument. I don't think this is just me talking. This is a very non-essential conclusion of anarchism. This is just the host, Adam, talking. I don't think it's worthwhile to channel anarchist intent into political actions. I have no interest in trying to vote out Social Security or vote out regulations or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any of it. I don't think you'll ever be successful in that arena, and I don't think it's worthwhile. I think it's a waste of energy. I think if you believe that is the case, what you should do, that those things are not useful, that there's a better way of doing it, what you should do is just invent the better way of doing it. And that is the ultimately, in my opinion, the only way of convincing people that anarchism will work is by showing them that it does work. The only way to convince people that you don't need government for something is to show them how it works without government. As I said, Bitcoin is a great example of that. Uber is another imperfect example, but an example, as well as Airbnb and more. The peer-to-peer economy, there's another term to look up. So we are past 45 minutes. There was my friendly introduction to anarchism. I hope you don't feel like you were being cajoled into anything. I hope that it was fruitful. And like I said, if I breezed over something that you found interesting, but maybe I didn't go deeply into it, because even at 45 minutes, that was a primer. Trust me, this rabbit hole goes deep. If you're interested in anything that I said, please email me at host.peacepropaganda.com. Say, hey, Adam, what the hell were you talking about at blah, blah, blah point in the show? I want you to defend that, and I will be more than happy to. So, that's it for December 7th, 2014. If I do not put out a show before, have a great holidays. Goodbye.